Those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Audre Lorde. I have chosen to speak about Audre Lorde today. She's a black feminist poet, and in our society we are witnessing things that are very relevant to what she was facing back in the 1970s, and her words still ring true today. So we will take a look at the environment, such as the civil rights movement, Audre Lorde as a feminist poet, and then the way Audre Lorde's words affect us today in our society. In the 1950s, African Americans and LGBT people experienced a myriad of bans against their civil rights as humans, and specifically in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education stated that schools could no longer be segregated. In 1960, at the age of 6, Ruby Bridges became the first African American girl to integrate into a Southern elementary school. And here in this photo, we are highlighting Ruby Bridges being escorted by U.S. Marshals. And in that moment in time, she thought that all these individuals that were around her were yelling and cheering for her, thinking that it was a parade for her to go to school. It was only till she got a little bit older and realized that this was not a parade cheering her on for school. And even even after the passing of the Brown versus Board of the integration of African American children into white schools, she was still facing a lot of hate against her, and only one teacher would teach her in that first year. And in 1963, we have the march in Washington, D.C. And some of us may know it as when Martin Luther King gave the I Have a Dream speech. And in this whole organized march, it was organized by a gentleman named Bayard Rustin. He was a close advisor to Martin Luther King, and he was also a homosexual male. At this time, he was asked by confidants of Martin Luther King and other people to hide his sexuality. They thought it was a moral wrong, and they also didn't want to have his sexuality disrupt the whole civil rights movement. So Bayard decided at that time to hide his sexuality and continue on supporting and organizing the march and other civil rights movements. It is in the 1960s that we see social activism rising up amongst African American people, people that were facing homophobia, racism, and classism. And during this time, this is when Audre Lorde came out as a black feminist lesbian poet. And in some of her works, she highlights how there's a big, huge disparaging gap between a white feminist and a black feminist. How some white women may not experience the same hardships as a black woman. And in one of her works, in Sister Outsider, we have a quote that says, "You fear your children will grow up to join the patriarchy and testify against you. We fear our children will be dragged from a car and shot down in the street, and you will turn your backs upon the reasons they are dying." This was this came from a speech at Amherst College in 1980. And some of her works in Sister Outsider highlight the racial differences, and a lot of readers have felt very uncomfortable by reading some of her work, as it points out the differences between black lesbians and straight black women, how at that point in time they were viewed less than, making it even harder on black lesbian women in the 1970s to rise up. And it was also during this time that she highlights the white privilege. And one of the issues that came up was that Lorde was trying to reach out to an author, and she was hoping to speak to this author and have her viewpoints as a black feminist understood, that she has to go a lot further than a white feminist, and she was hoping to have an open dialogue with this author, but she never responded to Audre Lorde. So during that time, Audre Lorde faced a lot of hurdles, and at times her work was uncomfortable for some people, but it really was pushing the boundaries back in the 1970s. So we face, as Americans, we face a lot of issues today, and a lot of these truths and words that Audre Lorde wrote about, it really resonates with us, what is happening in our society. And in the Women's March of 2017 was brought on by remarks that Trump has said when he was proceeding to try to take office, and when he took office. He had some quotes such as, "Grab them by the pussy, you can do anything. There's nothing I love more than women, but they're really a lot different than portrayed. They are far worse than men, far more aggressive, and boy, can they be smart." And it was during this time that the Women's March was decided to take a march on Washington, D.C., just like in the Civil Rights March in 1963. And some of the organizers even looked upon Audre Lorde's work and highlighted to white participants in the Women's March to understand their privilege and acknowledge the struggle that women of color face. So we see here that some of the works that Audre Lorde used is still being used today. And Audre Lorde has been recognized most recently by the Women's National Soccer Team of this year. You can see her jersey being worn here, and she's surrounded by other players that have supported other women throughout history, such as RBG, Beyonce. So she's still continuing to inspire young women all across the world. And whether you identify as a person of color, queer, or male, Audre Lorde has brought awareness to privileges we may or may have not, we may have or not have, and that these issues continue to resonate even after her passing 27 years ago. So I'll leave you with this. In this world where at times it seems hate may divide us and no one may ever understand who we are, remember this quote: "It is not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate these differences." Audre Lorde.